Good evening and welcome to another new episode of WTFriday. The big holiday is right around the corner, so keeping in the tradition of providing quality holiday content, tonight I'm going to be talking about a murder that took place on Christmas Eve in 2002. In fact, throughout the entire month, I also have a few bonuses coming your way. Most of them are flashbacks from previous episodes that included or were entirely based on crimes that took place over the Christmas holidays. Those will be coming your way on Wednesdays and Saturdays this month. And the first one aired this past Wednesday night, or Wednesday afternoon, I should say. And it was about the massacre of a family in North Carolina. And if you haven't already listened to it, you'll want to check it out. Now, if you've listened to me for a while, you know that last year we were in several Christmas parades, and they were a lot of fun. But y'all, this year I couldn't do any of them because my car had been giving me issues, and I can only imagine how embarrassed we would have been if we were to break down right in the middle of the parade route. And if the kids had been in the car with me, well, they'd never get in the car with me again. Well, now the car's fixed, and I just want to give a big shout out to my awesome son-in-law, Justin, for fixing it for me. And y'all, all that it was a loose wire that connects the battery and alternator. It was just something simple. But anyway, let's get started with tonight's episode.
Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listener discretion is advised.
The beginning of tonight's story starts with an arrest. Yep. So, Ernest Wholaver was arrested in July of 2002. I don't know why I'm having a hard time with that. Anyway, he was arrested on charges of multiple sexual offenses involving his two daughters, Victoria and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, she was only 15 when those charges were filed. So, since she was a minor, the kid's mom and Ernest's wife, Jean, she got an order of protection, and one of the conditions of that order was that Ernest be evicted from the family's home. And also, he was prohibited from owning or purchasing firearms. Well, when he was arrested on those charges, his attorney convinced the court at his bond hearing that Ernest was not a flight risk, so he was released on a $100,000 bail. Well, once he was released on that bail, Ernest moved in with his parents and his younger brother, Scott. Now, at some point after he moved in, Ernest convinced his brother to drive him to his former home, where his wife, daughters, and his 9-month-old granddaughter lived. Well, Scott agreed to it, and on Christmas Eve, the two set out for the home in Middleton, Pennsylvania. And when they arrived, Scott stayed in the car while Ernest went in and killed his wife and two daughters, each with a single gunshot to the head. Now, that 9-month-old granddaughter, she was found unharmed. And from there, the brothers drove to Clearfield County, where Ernest disposed of the weapon that he had used, along with other incriminating evidence. Now, there's a lot more details to it, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Now, the bodies of the three would be found on Christmas Day after Jean, Victoria, Elizabeth, and Victoria's 9-month-old daughter hadn't shown up for the traditional Christmas Eve dinner that they always had at Jean's parents' home. And the family had been trying to call Jean at her home, but the calls went unanswered, and she didn't return any of those calls. So Jean's mom was worried, and she decided to call the police. She asked if maybe there had been an accident on the highway, that they would have been on going from their home to the parents' home. Well, when they told her there hadn't been, she decided to call the Middletown police, and she requested a welfare check. Well, the dispatcher there at the Middletown Police Department told them that it was, still on Christmas Eve, and that if she still hadn't heard from Jean by the next day, to call them back. Well, Christmas morning comes, and there's still no sign of Jean, and the girl's arriving, so she calls the Middletown police again. Sergeant Robert Givler had just come on duty when he was given the call for the welfare check by dispatch. When he first arrived at the home, nothing looked suspicious at all. He knocked on the door and he rang the doorbell. There was no answer. When he looked through the windows, he really couldn't see anything. Then he goes around to the back of the house and sees that the garage windows are broken out. The garage door isn't latched, so he lifts it and sees that the family's car is still there. There's a door that leads into the home in the garage, and when he knocks on it, it eases open. And as he enters, he announces that he's there, but he still gets no response. As he enters the kitchen, he finds the body of a female lying on the floor. He checked her, and she's cold to the touch. And at this point, he calls for backup. It doesn't take long for that backup to get there. The officers clear the scene to make sure the perpetrator isn't still there, and they secure the scene while they're waiting on homicide investigators to arrive. And as they're clearing the bottom floor of the home, they hear a noise coming from upstairs. So with their guns drawn, because they didn't know what the source of that sound was at this point, they slowly go upstairs. And when they get upstairs, they find the body of a second female lying in the hallway with a baby in her arms. One of the officers took the baby downstairs while Givler continued to search upstairs. Fortunately, the baby's okay other than being a little dehydrated, and it's believed that she had been left alone for around 30 hours. In his search upstairs, Givler finds the body of the third female lying across a bed in a bedroom at the end of the hall. All three had suffered from close-range gunshots to the head. Elizabeth was the one that was found laying across the bed, and her gunshot wound had entered through her left eye, and it had been fired at such a close range to her that there were burn marks around her eye. And she also had burn marks on her hand, so it's believed that she had grabbed the barrel of the gun in maybe a last-ditch effort of self-defense. A crime scene investigator on the scene found that several wires at the back of the house had been cut, and it's believed that it was done so that the victims couldn't call for help. And as we know, in pretty much all investigations for homicide, the people closest to the victims are the first to be looked at. And it didn't take long or rocket science to figure out who authorities believed was their prime suspect. Police traveled to Cambria to question Ernest. He told police that he had heard about the murders from other family members, but he had no idea who could have done that to them. Plus, he had an alibi. He said that he and his brother Scott had been spotting deer and coyotes in the mountains there in Cambria County. And they were doing that from about 2 that morning, and they had left that area around 9 a.m. And when they talked to Scott, he gave them the same alibi. They did check into a few other persons of interest, and one of those was the father of Victoria's baby, and his name is Francisco Ramos. He and Victoria had had a tumultuous relationship when they previously lived together, and police had even been called to the home during that time. And at one point, there was a paternity dispute until DNA testing proved that he was the baby's dad. But Ramos was able to provide an alibi that checked out, and he was cleared. Victoria had also been in a relationship with a man named Turner Higgins, and they had just broken up. But Higgins also had an alibi that checked out, so he was also cleared. A search warrant was executed first on the home that the murders had taken place in at, and then on Ernest himself, along with Scott's vehicle in the home of his parents. The authorities found what they needed, including a note in the trunk of Scott's car that was written in Scott's handwriting, and it said, quote, "We were out spotting deer and coyotes." And soon, Ernest was arrested on 3 counts of first-degree murder. And it wasn't long before Ernest found out that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty in a case against him, Now, I just want to say that right now, I don't know what's up with these people like leaving notes that can be found. Because when we talk about the Thanksgiving murders of Joel Guy Jr. last week, he had notes that incriminated him. So I just don't understand how people do all this stuff. But anyway, Scott was arrested also. And after he was shown crime scene photos of his sister-in-law and his nieces, he broke down and admitted to driving Ernest to the home and waiting in the car while the murders were carried out. He was found guilty of third-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 12 and a half to 25 years in prison. And Scott agreed to act as a witness for the prosecution in the trial of his brother Ernest. As part of that cooperation as a witness for the prosecution, Scott led the police to the location in Clearfield County, and police were able to locate the murder weapon and some other evidence. Before the case against Ernest went to trial, those 6 charges against him were consolidated into the murder charges. Prosecutors claimed at the trial that Ernest was afraid that his daughters were going to testify against him, and this is why he killed the 3 women. As part of his testimony, Scott stated that after Jean sought out a divorce from Ernest, Ernest stated that he would shoot her. According to Scott, Ernest told him while they were out drinking on Christmas Eve, that's when Ernest convinced him to drive him up to the house that he formerly lived in, and all he wanted to do was pick up a puppy that he had left behind when he was forced to move out. Well, he claimed that he didn't know that he was driving his brother there to kill his family. He went on to say that when they arrived in town, Ernest told him to park their car about a block away from the house and wait. Well, Ernest walked towards the family home, and when he returned like 5 or 10 minutes later, he was clearly shaken, and he was very agitated. From there, Ernest told his brother to drive to Clearfield County, and he watched as Ernest disposed of the murder weapon. And as a matter of fact, he had 2 guns. It was a handgun and a shotgun. And he also said that Ernest told him that if he was ever questioned, to give authorities a false story. Scott wouldn't be the only witness called on by the prosecution. Several prisoners were called on also. And those prisoners gave testimony that included several incriminating statements about things that Ernest had told them. Maybe the most damning statement was the fact that while in jail, Ernest had tried to hire a man from West Virginia to kill the father of his granddaughter, and that man's name was Francisco Ramos, like I had said earlier when we talked about him. And he wanted to make it look like a suicide, and Ernest thought that evidence could be falsified to suggest that Ramos had killed Jean, Victoria, and Elizabeth. He even had a suicide note planned out that would say that he was the actual killer of Jean, Victoria, and Elizabeth. Well, the prisoner he had talked to about all this was a man named James Meddings. And Meddings went to jailhouse authorities about this, so they had a DEA agent pose as a hitman, and the discussion between the agent / hitman was recorded. Well, besides witness testimony, a pretty good amount of other evidence was presented at the trial. And some of that included testimony by Elizabeth and Victoria from the sexual assault case, and the prosecution used that to prove that Ernest had killed his daughters along with their mom to prevent them from providing further testimony against him. In the end, Ernest was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, killing prosecution witnesses, conspiracy, reckless endangerment of a child, which was his granddaughter, burglary, and criminal solicitation in his attempt to have a hitman kill Ramos. But get this, he was acquitted of the sexual offenses because the witness in that part of the case were deceased. But y'all, to me, the fact that he killed those witnesses says everything we need to know about his guilt when it came to molesting his daughters. And when the trial went to the penalty phase, prosecution used the in perpetration of a felony, grave risk, multiple murders, and protection of abuse violation, along with evidence introduced during the guilt phase. The defense, however, used the fact that he had not had a previous history, prior criminal convictions, and catch-all mitigators. But when all was said and done, jurors returned 3 death sentences. And his conviction came in 2004. But as of this day, he's still sitting on death row at Phoenix State Correctional Institute in Pennsylvania. And several appeals to have the sentence have been denied. And this story, it just sickens me. I mean, the man molested his daughters and then he killed them, along with their mom, to keep them quiet. And that poor baby had to grow up, or is still growing up, without her mom, her aunt, and her grandmother. Now, Ernest Wholaver, he ruined so many lives in so many ways. And then, after he's arrested for those murder charges, he tries to end another life and pin all the blame on that person. And in case you're wondering what happened to Victoria's baby after all of this happened, I haven't been able to find information on this, but I hope that she's living her best life despite what happened to her family. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode. Be sure to come back on Monday for an all-new mystery, murder, and mayhem. Oh, and also, one of those bonus episodes that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode is set to come out to y'all tomorrow at noon. That's noon Eastern. Well, y'all have a good night.